Now, Rory started his career as a graduate at Ogilvy and worked as a copywriter and creative director, I think about 20 years. And Rory's currently vice chair of Ogilvy Group in the UK. And by his own admission, he says that's a role that gives him a sort of a very broad and roaming remit to suitably vague, I think is the words that
Yes.
and so it may sound that Rory's career is quite linear in terms of him being at Ogilvy for quite a while, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And so I think you'll hear many different aspects of Rory's thinking and experience. Indeed, Rory is a global TED speaker, no less, 7 million views, I think, and counting. He was president of the IPA, he's been a Cannes judge. He's also an author, most recently with Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. So this gives a little insight into where I think Rory is actually without peer in terms of his understanding of how people's brains and minds work. So sometimes described as behavioural economics, but I think Rory is a master and has an amazing ability to capture the beautiful irrationality of human beings. So today we're also hoping to get an insight into what makes Rory tick and how rational or otherwise his own journey has been through life up to this point. So I'm going to hand over to Rory and to Richie, and we'll get started with the questions. But very, very good to have you on, and thanks for your time, Rory.
It's a huge pleasure. This is fantastic. Welcome, everybody.
Rory, well, look, just for me, welcome to the show. Absolute legend, and it's always great to speak to you. Rory, by your own admission, you say that you were probably one of the worst account managers in the industry, which is a beautiful line, and we'll talk to that in a bit. But love to pick your brains and understand a little bit about what attracted you to advertising as a graduate in the first place.
Funny enough, in an unusual kind of recommendation for those psychographic tests, which I'm normally very cynical of, when I was at school, the careers service at Monmouth School, Haberdashers Monmouth School, to give them a little name plug, which was run by a brigadier, a retired brigadier at the time. This was England in the 1970s and 80s. And I took a psychographic test as to what sort of career I should do. And I think advertising came in at number 2. And so that was, I think it was something like barrister, advertising, and then the third one was something completely bizarre, which I can't even remember, but it was something that I'd never even contemplated. And I'd always loved ads as a kid. I grew up on, if you think about it, it was 2 things. It was great TV advertising, the Smash Martians and so on, and the Cresta Bear. And it was also, of course, we often forget that, it was an era of fantastic press advertising. So my brother, who was 18 months older than I, he and I would fight to get the Sunday Times colour magazine first on a Sunday, not for the content, but principally for the ads. And we kind of, I have to say, I think I still feel a slight resentment that that's a bit of a lost art, or at least a lost area of attention in advertising, which is the, long copy or medium copy or just incredibly elegantly constructed press ads. Are a glorious form of communication at their best. And I one of the problems, actually, I don't. It's often blamed that creative people can't do them. Oh, they can't write, so you never get any long copy ads. They're strangely very difficult to sell to clients. I've never quite understood that, and I suspect secretly the reason may be that they're a real pain to get through the legal department, because the more words you write, the more tedious the approval process becomes. And this is, by the way, the reason the Economist poster campaign arose, which is that David Abbott found it so painful getting long copy press ads through the Economist's approval process that he said, right, next time we're going to do posters. But then what happened is I wasn't absolutely sure at the end of, I did classics at university. I wasn't absolutely sure what I wanted to do. And I thought my girlfriend, now wife, was a modern linguist. So she was going to be there for 4 years instead of 3. So I did a teacher training course, which I actually mostly enjoyed. I really enjoyed the teaching, but it also, when I did my term of teaching, I had a kind of panic attack because I realized, hold on a second, if I go and do this, my whole life will be school, university, and back to a school again. I said, if I want to do this, I've got to do something else first, because this is crazy. And so I'd started applying for advertising agencies, and I remember actually, I suppose it must have been the great Drayton Bird, although I didn't know who it was at the time. I went for the interview at Ogilvy and Mather Direct, and I'd come from a kind of staff room where people were saying Fothergill miner's been smoking behind the bike sheds again, you know. And as I was waiting for my first interview at Ogilvy and Mather Direct, I think Drayton Bird swanned in from Heathrow, and somebody said, "How was it?" He said, "It wasn't great. I had to change planes at Addis Ababa," or words to that effect. And I thought, you don't really hear that in the classroom. This actually sounds pretty cool. And I have to say, actually, well, you know, one great defense of advertising and marketing is if you want an area which is A, infinitely interesting and rewarding and rewards your curiosity, and B is, let's be honest, tolerably lucrative, because probably aged 20 something, 21, 50% of your motivation for working, you modern kind of weird urban types won't understand this with your bloody travel cards and your fixie bicycles. But back then, if you're about 22, 23, what you really wanted was a flash car. Do either of you remember this? That a principal part of your motivation was what car you had. And you knew to an extraordinary level of detail what cars other people in the organization drove. I don't know what anybody else drives now. I've got 15 colleagues. I haven't got a clue what cars they've got. Back then, you knew everybody down to the sunroof, you know, what everybody drove.
You drive an Uber.
Yeah, you drive an Uber now. Yeah.
There you go. Times change. But Rory, it's evident that you love the craft of advertising. And you know, you can recall examples like nobody else I know. But are you optimistic or pessimistic about that craft in a digital world?
I think two unpredicted and really unfortunate things happened. First of all, I'll be absolutely honest with you, and I said this the other day, and this is slightly kind of contentious. I never understood the split between media planning and creative. Okay, it never made any sense to me in terms of the creation of value. There's a sort of argument for centralization of media buying. I get that. Although, to be absolutely honest, the gains to centralization in buying are never that great because, let's be honest, if you've got some media going cheap, the last people you're going to tell are Group M, right? Okay, you go and find some small media boutique and let them know there's a bargain going, right? So it's not quite as clear cut as all that logic suggests. Okay, but because people who studied economics believe, we'll get back into this later, but anybody who studied economics treats economies of scale as like an axiomatic truth. Okay, and you know, they're obsessed with gains to scale. But separating media planning from creative was a fundamental mistake. And I'll give it to you on three reasons. One is what I call the Sudoku problem, that who you talk to, when you talk to them, and what you say are patently interrelated. Okay, so what I always say is you can't take a Sudoku. This is meaningless to people who don't do Sudoku, so apologies. But you can't cut it into 9 squares, hand each square to different people and say, can you solve for your individual quadrant, please? Because the whole thing's interdependent. It's all interconnected. The second thing is, I think the relationship with the client changed because when you had media and you had creative in-house and you had planning, when I was a copywriter, which I was for 20 years, there's a basic rule of thumb, which is when you were happy, the creative team were happy, the planner was happy, and the media guy was happy, you knew you were onto something. Okay, you know, if you just left it to creative people would occasionally come up with an incredibly elegant solution, but it didn't scale beyond 200 people. And you said, well, since we're actually a mass market FMCG product, I don't think selling to 200 people is quite going to cut it here, as the media guy would sensibly point out, you know. And when you had all three parties happy, you had something. But it also meant you took your client a ready-to-bake solution. And now, because you separate media and you separate creative, it's a bit more like a Mongolian barbecue. All you can do is suggest ingredients. You're not actually coming to them and saying, effectively, put that in the microwave, you know, press, you know, 3 million quid plus 90 seconds, and you've got yourself a business solution ready to go. Instead, clients are forced to, you know, essentially make decisions between a whole bunch of not necessarily fully coordinated ideas. And so that's pissed me off. I mean, that it always struck me as a totally dumb decision. I think the other things that are problematic, I mean, obviously commission was a terrible way to be paid and has, by the way, long-term problems, because I think ad agencies are under-involved in client problems because they have this kind of muscle memory where the only client problems worth addressing are the ones that come with a media budget attached. Well, we haven't been paid on commission since 1989. You know, actually, for every person with a problem and a media budget, there are 100 people with a problem and no media budget, where a really good mixture of insight, psychology, and creativity is exactly what's needed. But the one good thing about being paid on commission, which I don't think anybody noticed, was that when the clock wasn't running, clients would probably involve you really early because they go, we've got this thing we're doing in 2 years' time, and we might as well talk to the agency people because until we actually buy any media, those bastards are free. So let's tell them about it now. Okay. Whereas when you create an agency charging mechanism a bit like Uber, where, where you don't book an Uber midway through the party, right? You go, okay, last minute, okay, I will really need to catch that train, book the Uber now. I think one of the problems of being paid by the hour is that agencies probably get involved later. And we never notice. All I'm saying, I'm not suggesting that. There are upsides to being paid by fee. There are downsides to being paid by commission, which I think are obvious, and it was untenable. The other thing that's happened, by the way, which is that, and even Google next week, Google will tell you this, okay? They know from all their data that the thing that makes the most difference above a certain point, once you get to a certain point of competence, the thing that makes a transformative difference in any ad is the creative. And yet most of the attention in digital is focused on optimizing the targeting. And in fact, creative agencies don't even get to produce the creative for digital ads most of the time. It's farmed out as part of a media deal. And I very rarely see anything digital where I go, ooh, David Abbott could have written that. You know what I mean? And I did make this point that, look, for the money you're spending on that MarTech stack, you could have hired David Abbott for his entire lifetime. Okay. And I boldly suggest that the second would have made more difference to your business than the first. Yeah. And the other thing is, I mean, okay, it's easy to form a kind of template for media testing, and it's harder to form a kind of template for creative testing. But nonetheless, in the few occasions where we've been allowed to do it, there's a fantastic case for KFC in Australia, which one of my colleagues did as part of the behavioral science practice when he was out there, where the best way to sell $4 fries, by the way, for KFC is a headline that says maximum 4 per customer. And because we're not testing creative, and the place to test creative is in digital, where you can fail economically and really fast. But there's probably a silo where there's a guy who's being bonused on his digital activity who can't afford to do any testing because his bonus is basically dependent on incremental improvement of what he's already doing. And the real value of digital is creative experimentation. That's probably the greatest area where we can deliver real magic, and yet it never happens.
That's a
let me take you back to the last time that we spoke, where actually you had a string of morning sessions all around the world, given the new format and ways of working that we're in currently. And I just want to ask, how have you been coping for the last couple of months, and what are some of the changes that you're seeing as a consequence of the pandemic we're going through?
I really, really like this new way of working. Now, funnily enough, I was a huge evangelist for flexible and remote working before the pandemic happened, which was a bit of an advantage to us, I have to say smugly, because when we hit lockdown, a very brave PA went into the office, I think one day after lockdown or the day before, and rescued all the large monitors and dispensed them to the team. But we'd already had a lot of practice because I was doing things like Zoom Fridays a couple of years ago, where the whole team would work over Zoom on Friday. There was some inspired person in the Ogilvy IT department about 2.5 years ago who took out WPP uses Teams, but Ogilvy took out this separate Zoom account. And the great thing about Zoom is that generally it's so simple to use that even the most incompetent person on the call is going to make a reasonable hash of it. Because of course the quality of a Zoom call depends on the worst participant to some extent. You know, if there's this one guy who hasn't muted their microphone or whatever, you know, or tries to do it on a mobile phone, which, you know, while in a taxi, you know, it can ruin the whole thing. And so what I discovered very early on was very interesting, which is that everybody really wanted to do more of this. And in a funny kind of way, everybody believed that they personally could work remotely. Of course, I'm a responsible and highly committed individual, and I don't need a large amount of supervision. But all these other people do. And it was only when we had the COVID pandemic that we realized that this can really, really work protractedly and at scale. Sorry, my webcam has gone all blurry. There we are. Pay attention. There we are. And it's fascinating because it's actually, I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting marketing case study, which we need to understand. Why did it take because I have this theory, okay, it's a really outrageous theory, that most of the constraints on economic growth, economic progress, social environmental progress, most of the constraints on that progress in the developed world, okay, are now marketing problems. They're not principally economic problems of supply. They're actually demand problems. In other words, solar panels are really actually pretty good and they're pretty cheap. The really big problem is getting people to put them on their roof. And that economics is now increasingly should be, if it were honest and intellectually honest, economists would say, look, increasingly, we need not the expertise of kind of, you know, talking about logistics, distribution, manufacturing, you know, and efficiencies. We need actually to develop a psychological arm because most of the things that are holding us back. There are a few economists who believe this, by the way. I'm not totally out on a limb by saying this. Most of the problems now are principally psychological. They're problems of behavior change. Then, you know, if you think about it, economics had its origins in the 18th century, where most people were kind of hungry most of the time, and luxury goods, really exciting goods, were unbelievably expensive. Okay, so then, you know, don't get me wrong, you know, it's a problem of manufacturing and supply. But now, particularly, obviously, for things like digital products, where the marginal cost, of course, is often zero. Then those rules don't really apply anymore. You know, if you want someone to download a free app, it's not really an economic problem, is it? In the purest sense, because the damn thing's free. And so I think what's so interesting about that to me is that we saw this case where, when we were forced to under a pandemic, we discovered a new and, to many people, improved form of working, which also frees us, if you think about it as a three-way win, okay? So when I employ, I mean, to be honest, Mark and I are both okay, because I had no idea of Mark's property situation, by the way. For all I know, he might be renting a place, but I'm assuming that because of our age, we got into the London property market at a time where you're either positive or you're neutral, okay? I'm kind of a bit positive. I sold a flat in London too early. You know, I made a lot of mistakes, but basically my mortgage isn't something that's a huge part of my outgoings. So my accommodation costs are kind of like, they're not a rounding error, but they're not huge. Now I suddenly realized that for my staff under 30, okay, once we've paid them and they've paid tax, 50% of the money goes in transportation and accommodation costs. So if they had a bit of freedom to live further from London or to come into London less frequently and therefore cut their transportation costs, and we also petitioned the government to get rid of this stupid season ticket Victorian idea and introduce carnets for travel as well, by the way. I mean, you know, the season ticket's a completely 19th century idea. And, you know, the payment technology now is so sophisticated, it's laughably crude. But, you know, we can give our staff a 20% after-tax pay rise for free. Not to mention the fact that we're also paying for their desk cost in some of the most expensive real estate in the world. So if you get rid of the transportation costs, personal accommodation costs, you can reduce office costs. It's an incredible way in which you could actually improve productivity, pay people more, and make more money. And the other thing we were talking about, funnily enough, just before we started, it's a classic. There are two things going on here, I think. One of them is there's a network problem, which is video conferencing is one of those technologies where it only becomes valuable when it hits a certain penetration level. It's like the fax machine. I had a friend, believe it or not, who had a fax machine in the 1970s. And I said, well, who did you send faxes to? And he said, oh, we owned another fax machine in Los Angeles, and we used to send faxes to each other. He said, we never sent a fax to anybody else because we didn't know anybody else with a fax machine, right? And if you think about it, if the mobile phone had only allowed you to call other mobiles, it hadn't been interoperable with landlines, mobile phone penetration and growth would have taken place 10 or 12 years later than it did. I had a mobile phone quite early, so early, in fact, that people shouted abuse at you if you made a mobile phone call on Oxford Street. I can remember this. 1989, someone rings me. I put this brick to my ear. Passing cars shout wanker at you for using a mobile phone on Oxford Street. It wasn't my fault. They rang me, for goodness sake. But a mobile-to-mobile call was really rare in the first few years of mobile phones. You actually commented on it. You said, "Ooh, we're both on our mobiles. Hey, this is amazing." Most of your calls were to landlines or from landlines. And so if you think of that problem that had mobiles only been able to call other mobiles in the way that fax machines could only call other fax machines, the whole penetration of mobile, because the benefits would have been delivered much, much more slowly. Because nobody would buy a mobile until they knew 4 other people with a mobile. And, at that point, it's a Mexican standoff. And I think that was the case with Zoom. And I think there are, people always associate me with behavioral economics. I'm very happy with that. But I think there are 2 or 3 other disciplines that marketing needs to sort of glam onto. And one of them is kind of network theory and network dynamics. Another one is obviously complexity theory. Because if you want to understand markets as far as the interactions of individual market actors, you have to start understanding those things. And what was fascinating, I think, is we discovered that actually Zoom was rather like the mobile phone, something that was unbelievably valuable, or rather, like the fax machine. Nobody working at WPP knows what a fax machine is. Just teasing, Mark. Okay, but one of those things that's fantastically useful, but only when you reach a certain point on the Bass diffusion curve. And the other thing we learned was psychological, which is that, and this is the most really interesting discovery. The whole of labor economics assumed that you had 2 things that work was about. It was about how long you worked, hours, and it was about money. And the reason your salary is called compensation is that labor economics assumes that people don't like working, they do like leisure, they sacrifice leisure to the extent to which they need in exchange for money. And that's what work is about. And what we've discovered in the last 6 months, which is an incredibly valuable discovery, is that in most jobs, I think most people mostly enjoy their jobs. I'm not saying I wouldn't work a few fewer hours if I had complete control over it, etc. But most of my job is actually rewarding. And the fascinating thing is, what we've discovered is people don't actually want necessarily more money or shorter hours. The thing they might value is a third thing, which is a psychological thing, which is much harder to quantify, which is autonomy, which is freedom to do your work where you choose and freedom to do it when you choose. And actually, nobody's ever said, the great thing about autonomy, by the way, is if you give your staff autonomy, nobody knows how to tax it. Okay, so it's an incredible way to reward your staff in a way that probably improves their productivity, may even increase the hours they work. In fact, that's the evidence we're seeing from VPN data, that people start work much earlier, they end much later, but they do take a bit of a break in the middle of the day, which is probably healthy anyway. And so that discovery of the importance of autonomy, and what we didn't notice is that actually, if you go into blue collar work, you do have a bit of choice of the kind of work. If you decide to become a taxi driver, or you decide to become, say, a painter and decorator or a plumber or whatever, or you decide to become self-employed, a lot of that is probably driven by the need for, or the desire for a degree of autonomy. I met a brilliant retired taxi driver, and he'd retired, and then he said, I discovered something very interesting, that when it rains, a lot of people want cabs, but you can't play golf. So he cancelled his retirement, and every day he used to get out, look at the sky, and if it was raining, he drove a cab, and if it was sunny, he went to the golf course. That was a kind of beautiful autonomy. And once we just now, white collar work didn't offer much of this autonomy. It was called the 9 to 5. Okay, and it never occurred to us. And this is where I think marketing is at its greatest: is spotting needs which are literally not only unmet needs, but they're unthought and unspoken. They can only be felt. And I think this business of working autonomy is the classic understanding of the discovery of something which was an unthought need. We never realized the extent to which we cared about this. It was only when we experienced it that we thought, hold on, this is great.
Now, Rory, time has zipped by. We've only got 15 minutes left, and we're inundated with questions and comments. A lot of people saying could listen to you all day, but Richie and I are probably doing a terrible job of moderating. But I'm going to ask one question before we open to others. This show is about dealing with setbacks and pivots and so on. So, what would you say has been maybe your biggest regret, or how you've dealt with a really big setback? You're generally very positive and see the good in everything, but I'm sure there's been tough times.
Yeah, the thing I learned, funnily enough, some of those tough times, I was actually fired in about 1990. And then I rejoined, I was fired from the planning department of Ogilvy. It's a long story. And then that forced me to move to the creative department. So, I think it was very valuable in two ways. I'm deep down, I knew I wanted to work in the creative department, and I saw planning as a stepping stone there. And so being fired forced me to apply for a copywriting job, which I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. The other thing that being fired teaches you is, I would always say, always have a bit of a hinterland, okay? So don't become so focused on one thing that you're vulnerable. If you've got a bit of a hinterland, you can pivot or reinvent yourself. And I think this is the behavioral science practice has been a joy for me, because I don't want to be there after 10 years as a creative director. I don't want to be, sitting there like some big toad over the organization, preventing talented young people from moving up. And it was time for me to get out of the way. I'd done it for 8 years, reasonably successfully. It wasn't my forte, to be absolutely honest. I could do it, but bits of it were hugely rewarding and enjoyable, but it is, it's kind of quite stressful. And also, I think you kind of burn out a little bit. So the ability to reinvent yourself in the behavioral science field is something that has been really, really good. And I'm very grateful to Ogilvy for actually having the idea in the first place after I'd finished the IPA presidency. But I do think it's good to have, I always say, actually be good at two things. Don't focus too much on being good at one thing. Apart from anything else, the environment changes so fast that the ability to reinvent yourself is now vastly more valuable. I mean, there's a wonderful little example given which says that, imagine it's 1993 and you've got two kids and one of them studying telephone repair and the other one studying design. And you think, well, I'm confident about the telephone repair guy. He's got a whole paid life in front of him. But the guy doing design, geez, what an indulgence. And of course, the web happens. Telephones become so cheap or mobile that if a landline phone breaks, you chuck it away and plug in another one. The telephone repair guy is now stuffed, and the guy who studied design in about 1997 became the most desirable property on the market.
Rory, it's a great point there. And I just want to simply interject, because we've got so many questions coming through and about 12 minutes to get through some of them. So I just want to, first of all, to say thank you to everybody who's posted a question. Matt, Victoria, Noble, Simon, Alex, Deesh, Sajid, Raju, and Ist. So many people want to ask you a couple of things. So let me just pick out one. Deesh, I think we've answered your question around work culture in Rory's previous response. So let me go to a question from Matt. He asks, what advice would you give to spark creativity and innovation in a team? And just for the sake of trying to get through a few of these, let's try and keep it as brief as we can.
Well, I can answer two questions in one, because someone's also asking the question where I've commented on the slight decline in humour in the workplace. Now, a very boring explanation where you go, ooh, it's all political correctness gone mad. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is that there was a kind of mischief, and John Hegarty said something very similar, that essential in kind of creative problem solving is a kind of mental mischief. I have to confess, I was talking to a professor of ethics yesterday, like you do, a professor of bioethics, and confessing to the fact that this may be a product of working in advertising for 30 years, but if there's a really, really ingenious con, okay, or a really ingenious bank raid like the Hatton Garden job, where nobody's hurt, let's be absolutely clear about this, but if something's just really ingenious, you kind of half admire it just for its sheer ingenuity, and I do think that we've become a bit kind of, okay, let's follow the process, let's tick the boxes, etc. And the real breakthroughs in marketing come when you actually abandon an assumption that everybody else makes. Quite often creativity is a negative process. It's that everybody is assuming this thing, or everybody's looking at this thing in this one way. And you go, it's actually not that at all, is it? It's not that. People aren't doing it for that reason at all. They're doing it for this reason. And so it's that ability to be really mischievous and actually throw a cat among the pigeons, which I do feel has diminished a bit. And along with it, kind of mischievous humor, practical jokes. I mean, the kind of practical jokes we played every day in 1993 will get you reported to HR in 2020. Okay, I'll tell you a very quick story. I discovered that they were so short of meeting rooms in Soho Square that they erected a meeting room right next to the lift. Okay, and you could go down a floor, take a huge stack of stackable chairs, lean them outwards towards the lift doors, right? Hit 2 for the second floor, let the lift doors close with this huge stack of chairs leaning against them, and then you'd basically run upstairs. And then just as you got to the meeting room, you'd basically walk past whistling, looking completely innocent. And there'd be a bing, and the lift doors would open, and a whole stack of chairs would just crash right into the middle of the meeting room. Okay. Now, that was... Okay, you did that in 1992. That was kind of an average day in the office. Okay, that kind of mischief. And it's only oldies like me who notice, because it's one of those things where you need a bit of chronological context, the extent to which that's diminished. I'm not quite sure why it is, but it worries me just because David Ogilvy said something similar. Are you having fun? I find that the offices that are full of fun and foment tend to produce the best advertising. And David Ogilvy cited the fact that in Niels Bohr's laboratories, the scientists were always playing practical jokes on each other. And there's something about that, because what you need in someone who's in marketing, and that's true in sales as well, is you probably need a degree of intelligence. You need you patently need a degree of social awareness, but you also need this kind of slight, the kind of talent which, to be honest, if you were a criminal, you would put to bad use, which is just that ability to kind of try and... It's a kind of game theory. Dave Trott captures it very, very well in some of his writing. Predatory thinking, I think he calls it. And that's exactly what you need. It's kind of that air of, how can I, in a nice way, how can I get one up on everybody else by outthinking them? Cunning, a mixture of kind of cunning and ingenuity. And that's what we thrive on, I think.
Yeah, I can see that mischief coming through plenty. So one question from Alex. Which do you think is the least understood or least applied principle of behavioural economics?
Gosh, that's a great question. Whoa. There are so many of them, of course. Actually, funnily enough, the one that's probably underemployed, even though it's quite famous, is simply defaults. That people go with the flow of preset defaults, and so the other area, by the way, which I would argue, actually even more than this, I'll give you an even better example: pricing, which is, because of economics, which assumes that a pound is a pound is a pound, virtually no experimentation takes place with pricing. Now, in fact, how you charge for something whether you charge monthly, whether you charge annually, whether it's pay as you go, whether it's subscription, okay, all those little things, and how you describe your price, how you compare it, is unbelievably important. And yet, in proportion to the economic effect it has for any business, the amount of attention given to it, and certainly the amount of experimentation, is dismally, because it's something that market research can't really help with, because people always say as little as possible, and they'll always pretend that it doesn't make any difference whether they're paying £12 a month or £144 a year, and so on. So, and economics doesn't help you either, because economics assumes that that something that costs £2 is twice as expensive than something that costs £1. But as I always say about Nespresso, the fact that we compare it to Starbucks makes it cheap. If we compared it to Nescafe, it would be expensive. And the other one is path dependency in general, which is, I'm going to give Mark a tip here. No insurance company I know, right, gives you an opportunity once you've got a quote for third-party insurance and says you can upgrade this to comprehensive for another X pounds a year. Once you've chosen at the beginning, you're down that path, and you're given then a quote for third party, which you can either take or leave. And the assumption that there has to be, now there's another one I'll give you for the insurance industry, because I'm giving Mark free consultancy today. If you want people to tell the truth, one of the reasons people lie on their car insurance is because they don't know what the cost is of telling the truth. So let's say someone, not very honestly, says that their car's garaged overnight. And then later on, you say, if you don't want to garage your car overnight, it'll cost you another £30 a year. A hell of a lot of people go, it's worth £30 a year, to be honest. The reason they were lying in the first place is they were terrified that it was going to be 200. And so I think the weird thing is that so little outside the marketing department in an organization, there is nobody. And we always forget this. I always thought when I came to advertising that businesses, there'll be loads of psychologists all over the place. We can just concentrate on the advertising, because all that other stuff, I bet that, British Airways and everyone, they employ thousands of psychologists and people who are all studying price and the psychology of price. And then I discovered a bit like that line in Zulu, no, it's just us. It's only us. Outside of marketing, there is nobody really looking at the business for any protracted length of time through the customer's eyes. Nobody. And marketers need to realize that. Maybe, okay, there's HR who look at it through the employee's eyes to an extent. R&D at their best might do a bit of human-centered design. But it really is just us. And of course, the view of a company and the effect of a decision when viewed from a customer's eyes is often completely different from the effect of a decision when taken from the viewpoint of a balance sheet. And so the really useful thing about behavioral economics is just context matters, perspective matters. That's the central lesson of behavioral economics, is things aren't context free.
Love that response there, Rory. I want to pick up another question from Victor, based in Singapore. So he talks about the advertising industry is losing big time to consultancy companies.
Yeah.
Accenture, EY, Deloitte, etc. So how can advertising gain its place in important decisions of a brand?
This is a really, really interesting question. And the behavioral science practice at Ogilvy is part of Ogilvy Consulting, and the new chief executive of Ogilvy, I'm delighted to say, comes from Deloitte. Because my argument is that we've been hugely limited. The whole concentration of holding companies has basically been making the companies they own more alike and more efficient. And by the way, up to a point, I think, for the first 10 years, that's a valuable thing to do. The weird thing about ad agencies is they spent loads and loads of time saying, what's Ogilvy's unique this? It's kind of USP relative to BBH or BBDO. We're obsessed with that. We never spent any time going, is there a target market out there we haven't actually addressed? Okay, and we assumed that it was the marketing director of companies typically founded between about 1850 and 1920, somewhere between New York and Chicago. Okay, you imagine Heinz, P&G, or London, Unilever, And the obsessive focus on people who happen to have large media budgets, as though we could only produce value, as though ideas and creativity only have value when accompanied by a media budget. That's the huge self-limiting belief. And it's like a muscle memory from the days we were paid on commission. And so one of the great, look, most of the really valuable discoveries I made about behavioral science actually happened accidentally. And I always say this to people in Ogilvy, look, this is really, really simple, okay? When I talk about marketing and advertising, I get invited to marketing and advertising conferences. But when I talk about behavioral science, I get invited to 10 Downing Street. Now, that's telling you something that, and this is telling all marketers something. They got a branding problem. Okay. Now, Mark told me the story that I hope you don't mind me repeating this, that someone highly intelligent and brilliant from elsewhere in our organization was put on secondment to marketing, and he'd come from, say, data analysis. Very, very valuable field to have in marketing. Okay. And he actually said, I don't know why on earth they've seconded me to marketing, because I'm terrible at drawing. Okay. And we've got to realize that, okay, not in P&G, not in Reckitt's, not in sort of those, not in Diageo, which are those big companies where the chief executive has done a stint in marketing, but in finance, tech, and companies with a left brain culture, which is actually most of ad spend, never mind most of the economy, particularly in a place like London, okay, or B2B, okay, even bigger, B2B. Marketing is seen as basically it's reprographics with a degree. And I'm sure that isn't the case inside Direct Line, but as a marketer, you have to do a huge amount of work just marketing, because the second you're just seen as a cost and a support function, not as an essential source of solutions, you're kind of doomed. And I think what we fail to realize is the kind of brands we're working for are different, and the amount of power that the client has within those organizations, in some cases, is massively diminished. Now, the consultants didn't have any of those self-limiting beliefs about, well, we'll only talk to that kind of company and only if they've got a big budget to spend on a particular category. Consultants are free to wander and talk to absolutely everybody. And we have to do the same thing. And the great little trick of behavioral science and a few things like that is it's a great way. What I discovered is that actually chief executives absolutely love talking about marketing. They're fascinated by it until you call it marketing, at which point they say, you must go and talk to the marketing director. And I said a very scandalous thing in Ogilvy. I said, look, Ogilvy has always had a slogan, which is something like making brands matter or brand stewardship. And I said, my view, we got to stop doing that. And people look, that's seriously, it's like farting in church saying that. And my point was simply that we don't, not for a second do we doubt that brands matter. Brands are hugely important, and it's emphatically our job to build economic value through the creation and maintenance of great brands. Okay, but don't talk about brand, because the second you say brand, you're directed to the marketing guy. And so one of the things I said is, in a sense, what we got to learn to do is talk about marketing, but in completely different ways, so we can get under the radar everywhere else.
What a lovely
Rory, you've given us a masterclass in insights into the way that people tick and what makes the world go round. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We've been deluged with questions. We've got through some of them, but
do you want to do 2 minutes of like quick fire where I'm literally limited to?
Richie, if you is there one maybe that everyone's saying just let Rory talk, and I think you could talk for another hour and we wouldn't lose a soul. But I think we have to let everyone get.
Yeah, no, keep the promise. I agree, completely agree.
Their day jobs, but Rory, thank you so much. You bring a humour and a little bit of mischief and a lightness of touch, but just wonderful to hear you talk. We could stay here all day and it would be wonderful. But so thank you very, very much. I know Richie will say thank you as well. Just before we do close, just to remind everybody, we're on every week to bring this little bit of sparkle. Next week we've got Ronan Harris, who's VP and MD of UK and Ireland for Google. There's a long title. Ronan, another great guy with tremendous insight. So thank you for me, Rory, and have a great weekend, everybody.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
And Rory, just for me as well, just want to say a massive thank you to you. What a delightful session, what an inspiring session, and an insightful one. I also just want to say thank you to all the audience today and this morning for taking the time to spend a little time with us, and I hope to see you again next week.
Thank you, everybody, wherever you are, and stay safe.